Once we discover we're both autistic and ADHD, it feels like we've unlocked the key to everything. But then comes the real question. How do we actually use this key? I'm Adria Sophia Melikar, an AuDHD coach who's walked this path myself. I've spent over a decade helping hundreds who don't fit the mold to find their own way forward. On AuDHD Sparks, we're reimagining what's possible when we stop forcing ourselves to be who we're not and start doing life differently in ways that leave us feeling resourced and alive. Hello, welcome back to AuDHD Sparks. I am Adria, your host for this show. And today we are talking about that other label that many of us carried growing up, too sensitive. Now, last episode we decoded what shy actually meant, how it was code for an AuDHD kid caught in an impossible bind. If you haven't listened to that episode and you ever considered yourself shy growing up, it's definitely worth a listen. And today we're diving into sensitivity because often what others call too sensitive is actually our nervous system giving us accurate information about what we need. Remember that pattern that we talked about last episode when other people's needs are naturally met by how society is structured, and then they think that they're easy and low maintenance. And so here's another layer to this with sensitivity. When our sensory and emotional needs aren't automatically met and we have to ask for accommodations around them, then we might look difficult for that, right? But we're not actually more needy. We're still just trying to get to the same playing field as everybody else. So maybe you are not too sensitive. Maybe that sensitivity is actually information. All right, let's dig into this episode a little more. So I want to start by talking about the AuDHD sensitivity paradox because for us, everything always has to be a paradox. Just, it's how it is. But at least we can commiserate together around it, right? And find our ways together. So what I've learned from my own experience and from witnessing it with AuDHD clients is that our experience of being sensitive can be fundamentally different from being purely autistic or purely ADHD. So as AuDHDers, as usual, we're dealing with multiple layers here. So you've got the autistic sensitivity that shows up as sensory overwhelm, where lights are too bright, sounds too loud, textures feel wrong. And then you've got the ADHD sensitivity that's more emotional, rejection sensitivity, hypervigilance to others' reactions, feeling everything really intensely. And so if you are a sensitive AuDHDer, you've likely got both types of sensitivities going on. Welcome, welcome, my friend. We're in this together. And adding to that, your ADHD brain is constantly reading every micro expression of frustration that others have when you ask for the accommodations that your autistic nervous system desperately needs. And so this creates this sensitivity paradox where you are incredibly attuned to everyone else's comfort while being dismissed as too dramatic or, overstating your needs when you talk about your own needs. And so if this sounds familiar, you might recognize it in these moments where you notice that someone's cold and then you offer your jacket, but then when you mention you're overheating, you're told it's not that hot. Or adjusting restaurant seating so that everyone else is comfortable, but when you ask to move away from speakers, you're being difficult. This paradox is what can make the AuDHD sensitivity experience so maddening and so misunderstood. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when being thought of as a princess really meant like that you were creating protection or looking for protection around things. So remember that princess label from last episode. Here's how it shows up with sensitivity and why it was actually our nervous system trying to protect us. So for me, growing up, when I needed things a certain way, I got called a princess lovingly, but still was the case. And for years, I believed that meant I was demanding and difficult. But here's what was actually happening. I was having meltdowns because I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. I didn't know that I needed to know plans in advance or that transitions needed to happen slower for me. And so when something was sprung on me, I would hit a wall. I would get so upset and I would look unreasonable and over dramatic. And then I would feel bad about looking that way. That's still a thing, And my parents would say, why is she making this a big deal? But really the sudden change was hitting my nervous system hard and it was a big deal. So one pattern that is maybe kind of connected to this that I've noted is this contrast between how male autism can tend to get accommodated, while in women and girls, the same things are seen as demanding or needy. So my dad's boundaries were just accepted. Like if he didn't eat certain foods or didn't join in on social situations, that was just how he is. But when I had needs, like needing my dad to cut up my meat because the texture was overwhelming, or really struggling when friends had the TV on as background noise, then that was seen as princess behavior, right? All those things were strung together into the recognition like, oh, she's a princess. And aside from not eating bananas or eggs, my dad is hyposensitive to most things, meaning he actually is less bothered by sounds and smells and textures, temperatures than most people, even non-autistic people. And so we each have our own sensory profile with our own unique blend of hyper and hyposensitivities to different senses. And if you were labeled too sensitive, then you likely experience more hypersensitivity than hyposensitivity. So you may remember in last episode, I shared that in my family growing up, everything was based on science and what you could prove. Well, since my dad had that hyposensitivity and couldn't perceive what I was experiencing, and, I was never able to explain or measure my sensory needs, they weren't real to him and they weren't seen as valid in my family. And thus, I didn't see them as valid either for a really long time. And so no one was wrong here. There are no victims in this story. This is information, right? It's just helpful to look back and understand what was really going on, because my kid self made it mean something that now my adult self sees very differently. So does this spark anything for you or parallel anything in your own story? Take a moment to think about that. Okay, so let's talk about the HSP stepping stone. So here's something crucial that I've discovered working with AuDHD clients, and it connects directly to this sensitivity paradox we've been talking about. Many of us who were labeled too sensitive first identified as highly sensitive people before discovering we were AuDHD. I went through this journey too, and here's why it matters. HSP traits correlate most strongly actually with the AuDHD combination, not with pure autism or ADHD alone. I think that's so interesting and fascinating. Because think about it, the classic HSP profile includes hypervigilance to others' emotions, which is ADHD rejection sensitivity, plus sensory overwhelm, which is autistic sensory processing, plus environmental sensitivity, which is both of those working together. So sound familiar? That is exactly the sensitivity paradox that we've been discussing and we're talking about in this episode. And I could say, before I even discovered HSP, I had read Susan Cain's book Quiet when it first came out, and that was my first taste of sensitive isn't bad, and kind of identifying with this quiet archetype and with this different way of being in the world and needing recovery time and all of those things. And that was the real beginning of this whole recognition pipeline that I went through. And maybe you went through too. I imagine I'm not the only one who kind of had these different steps and stages. And then when a friend identified as HSP a little later in my life, I felt like this was an adjacent category to explore. Oh, that seems related. And I remember reading Elaine Aron's books, seeing myself in them. And what I loved about HSP, the HSP, ideas and philosophy and everything that was presented there, was how it took traits that had been pathologized and really reframed them. That is such a powerful thing. I mean, that's what I aim to do on this show. That's what this episode is about. And And that was like one of the first times like that. And I think Susan Cain's book and like these are those pieces in the puzzle where things start to get reframed and not pathologized, not seen as like, oh, this is like a description in the DSM or like this is what people see from the outside, and this is what makes you, difficult in the world, and what makes you a burden, or what makes you, not fit in, or whatever it might be, right? Like no, this is information. This is information. And so some of the traits that resonated for me as HSP that were actually AuDHD, both autism and ADHD working together are. So one is needing time to think before responding in conversations, which is, autistic processing. Being deeply affected by criticism or feeling like you're in trouble. That's ADHD, rejection, sensitivity dysphoria. Getting overwhelmed by too much information at once. That's both working together. Noticing patterns and connections others miss, that's autistic pattern recognition. Having intense emotional reactions to movies and music or conflicts, that is ADHD emotional sensitivity. Being bothered by sensory input like scratchy fabrics or bright lights, we've got autistic sensory sensitivity there. Or reading the room constantly and picking up others' moods, that's ADHD hypervigilance. And then we've got needing more downtime after social situations than others, which is both. We've got the autistic social energy drain plus the ADHD overstimulation there. So you can kind of see how all those pieces fit together, right? Like this was like an early part of this evolution in our understanding before AuDHD became this bigger thing, before as we started to like have more and more women or like folks who didn't fit that traditional quote male stereotypical model that were being identified. And so this was like part of our collective journey as society, I think, like getting to where we're going. And so that sensory piece of it was really big because before HSPs, there was nothing to explain why we felt these things so strongly. And then there was that emotional piece, like finally understanding that our intense interactions, intense reactions to things weren't too much, that they were just different processing. So these reframes were really big because they kind of hadn't been explained in a way that didn't make us wrong before. And so HSP was the first time that I realized this is real. I'm not just being difficult or overly emotional. And one insight in particular that stuck with me about HSPs that like surprised me, and then I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That tracks. Is that though we tend to think of sensitive people as like these soft, caring sweethearts, highly sensitive people can actually appear cranky or abrupt. Like, yeah, which others might see as difficult. And my internal experience is kind of feeling like this, like I'm this like mushy person who cares about everybody and everything internally and is constantly maneuvering to take care of others' needs. But I've also historically been exhausted and overwhelmed and burnt out, which means that I didn't always have the spoons for like social niceties, or not even social niceties, but like to be generous, to be kind all the time, to be, the way that I would want to be, because there just were no spoons for it. And, when we don't feel good, like it's just really hard to be nice. So here's what I want you to understand. People whose needs are naturally met have extra capacity that they can choose to use to be generous and warm. But when you're maxed out from sensory and emotional overwhelm, you might snap, you might seem abrupt, and it's not because you don't care, but because you're protecting your nervous system. So what looked like me or you being difficult was actually this nervous system protection. But HSP didn't explain the executive function struggles, the social communication differences, or why daily tasks could feel like impossibly hard. So it gave that partial language, but not the complete picture. I actually went to my first virtual neurodivergent meetup identifying as HSP. And then when I was there and I heard others sharing about their AuDHD, or not AuDHD, but their ADHD experiences, then I was like, oh, okay, that seems so familiar. And something really clicked for me. And then that led to my ADHD diagnosis, and then eventually putting pieces together of like, hey, wait, the social piece isn't really covered here. And I still feel shame around that when I'm in ADHD circles, like what's happening here? And like my pattern recognizing brain and like all these pieces, then I eventually kind of pulled in the autism piece, and then came understanding like how everything works together. And this is why the AuDHD correlation with HSP matters. If you identified as HSP first, you weren't wrong. You were accurately identifying the combination of emotional and sensory sensitivities that creates this unique experience. You just didn't have that complete framework yet for understanding why those accommodation requests could feel so impossible, and why you could read everyone else's needs but felt like dramatic or overreaching about your own. Okay, so let's shift over to talking about when your body gives you data. So let me tell you about the bike ride that changed how I think about my heat sensitivity, because your body might be giving you similar data that others dismiss. So this was a time where I was biking with my partner and some friends, and it wasn't a particularly hot day. And I say that living in Las Vegas, where it gets to 110 in the summer, and we live on a heat island with all kinds of asphalt and paved surfaces that make it feel even hotter. So I kind of maybe have a different bar, but this was like a Vegas spring or fall type of day, not a summer day, because I wouldn't even be bike riding because I would die. But anyway, so yeah, I was out with my friends. We were bike riding, several miles in. We had been in the sun. I had been biking. There was probably a little bit of an incline, and I hit a point where I just needed to get off my bike immediately, or I was going to fall off. And I had kind of had to stop the progression of us, and everyone kind of had to like wait for me. Like my vision was starting to black out because I was overheated, and nobody else was experiencing anything like this, or had experienced anything like this, or got it at all. They were really understanding and caring, and they stopped with me, and kind of we let me get back up to cooling down and everything. But they were kind of like what, like, this is so weird, what's happening? And I felt very dramatic about the thing. But yeah, here's really like what was going on in the background. So I'm in perimenopause, so maybe I was kind of on the bridge of going towards that. I have POTS most likely, and I'm autistic with like a really strong heat hypersensitivity. And these all interact together, amplifying the effect, making me very easily overheated, especially when I'm active. And when that happens, my vision can black out. I can get nauseous and dizzy. I need to sit down immediately. Like, this has been something since childhood. I can remember as a young, like junior high school age kid, every Sunday going out to do horseback riding and to spend the day at the stables, mucking out stalls or cleaning tack or things like that. And in the summer when it was hot and it was the middle of the day, I can remember times where like I had to sit down where my vision was blacking out, and I was like, would just sit down on the ground, like wherever I was at, and nobody would really pay much attention to me or like care or think much of it, because they didn't really get what was happening, And so none of this is dramatic. It is data. My nervous system is giving me crucial information about what I need to function safely. And that is awesome, right? Like, that's actually wonderful for us if we're trying to redesign our ecosystems around us to work with our nervous system and our brains and to like function really well. Then it's great to have information. And so the same thing happens for me with music. So music can be this complete emotional transportation for me. Like when I play this ancestral Slavic playlist that I've pulled together during my morning routine when I'm lighting a candle, and I feel like this spiritual connection to my roots, and I feel like fully my body, and I'm just like feeling it, right? But then put on aggressive gym music when I'm already dysregulated, and it just feels like this assault to my whole system. And so I keep loop earplugs in my purse, because the difference between those two experiences can be the difference between regulation and meltdown. And so yeah, this we go back to the recognizing these things about yourself and your sensory needs, right? And so are you recognizing yourself in any of this? This is my invitation to start paying attention to what your body is telling you, because it's not being dramatic, it's being accurate. Okay, so let's talk about the accommodation paradox. So this is a pattern, this is kind of like where that pattern of others dismissing our body's data shows up in so many places, and including in our closest relationships. So the clearest example of this sensitivity paradox for me came from a friendship dynamic that taught me, so much about how accommodation requests get perceived differently. So I am a very loyal friend who is much more likely to stick with someone past the point of when it's healthy for me than to leave them or end a friendship. And that's probably the autistic part of me. And so for years, I was really hyper vigilant about reading this friend's signals about how friendship should look, like that you should reply to texts quickly when you care, or you respond to every part of the message, or you add niceties and kind of ask about her day instead of just jumping in. You have important conversations face to face. Don't use written communication, like all of those pieces. And I couldn't always follow those signals, even though I knew that they were like I had this sense like, okay, that's what she wants, or that's what friendship means for her. That's what this friendship should have. I couldn't always follow them because there were times when, like a lot of those things, if you know anything about yourself or being AuDHD or ADHD or autistic, like a lot of those things can be very hard, like executive function wise or communication wise, or like just everything, nervous system wise. And so there were times that I would live in this angst, like my whole nervous system kind of being tense around not being a good friend. Like it would be there festering in the back of my mind if I struggled to reply to a text, or if it went weeks without reaching out to her, or if I had something important to say, but face-to-face made it really tough for me to think clearly. And so my ADHD brain was constantly scanning for the unspoken rules, while my autistic directness made me terrible at like this subtle social maneuvering that came really naturally to her. And so I essentially felt like I was just bad at looking good. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. Like, man, I would like when you see other people and getting their needs met and like asking for things and navigating stuff, and like nobody blinks and then you do it and you're like, you're seen as a super difficult person. I'm like, dang, I'm not good at looking good. What is that magical skill? So yeah, the world was already set up in her favor in most ways, right? It was set up in her favor so that when she did need accommodations, maybe around specific sensory things or asking her friends for support, like staying at their place or job help, she could be direct and it was respected. She had this skill that I lacked of making requests that somehow came across as reasonable rather than needy. And then meanwhile, when I finally started naming my needs around autism accommodations in our friendship, then suddenly I was being too much and our friendship kind of completed. So what I've learned from this pattern is this. It wasn't that she had fewer needs than me. It's that her needs aligned with social defaults while mine required active accommodation. And so she naturally got her needs met, so she thought that she was low maintenance. And then I had to ask for mine, so I was high maintenance. And so this is that accommodation paradox in action. We both had needs, and the difference was whose were built into the system. And if this dynamic sounds familiar in your relationships, you're not imagining it, and you're not necessarily needier than others. You're just more aware of what you need because you don't naturally get it. Okay, so let's talk about designing for your nervous system. So once I understood that my sensitivity was information and not a character flaw, everything changed. I stopped trying to be less sensitive and started designing my environment around what my nervous system was telling me. Because like, how can we stop being sensitive? How can we be less sensitive? It's like, that's not really in our control. Like, this is the nervous system and the brain we have, and we can disassociate. We can shut things down and shut them off, but that's not great. That's not great for us long term. And we can hide from the world. We can, like it's not like something that's in our control. And that's the important part to recognize about this, is that it's not about not having needs. Like, how do I like not have these needs? How do I get better at not having needs? Because that's not reality. It's about how do I like move through the world supporting my needs? How do I get information, like take information from this and then restructure things or set things up better so that I have those needs met, so that I have things set up in certain ways, so I know what to ask for, so I can, like kind of like there's a magic in that, right? Okay, so yes, so here's what this looks like practically for sensory needs. So in our home here, we are literally soundproofing our side of the new house, like the kind of the walls that that adjoin and abut to my parents' side of the house, because we're doing this intergenerational thing of two adult pairs living together, community care style. And so we are creating that soundproofing because the other side of the house is also the public side. It's the side where all the family comes over and gathers, where there's, little ones running around, and our living room and our living space is right up next to that. And it is quite dysregulating and, most importantly, out of our control, which is extra hard, right? Like we can't, if we want to plan to have a quiet evening, or if our spoons are really low, but then my mom decides to invite over friends for dinner and they're right on the other side of that wall and they're watching a movie or something, then our plans have changed, even if we're staying on our side. So I'm aware of this, like we're both very aware of this. And so this is baked into our plan for the space. It was from the very beginning. So we're creating, we're putting up extra drywall. We're putting up green glue as a sound barrier. We've sealed all the outlets. There's sound barrier insulation in the wall that, we added in, because we know our nervous systems get dysregulated very easily with noise. And I also created this sensory nook in the corner of our bedroom where I can kind of tuck myself away behind the bed, on the floor level with noise canceling headphones when I need to kind of not be perceived or kind of go in a little sensory cocoon. Really helps regulating my nervous system. I discovered this just by accident, or not by accident, really by necessity. When we first moved in, there wasn't a lot of stuff here. I didn't even have I felt like I didn't have anywhere to get away from my partner, like where I could just be and be completely, like decompressing and not feel seen. And my nervous system just like needed it so bad that I just went and I sat in the corner, like on the floor behind my bed. And I was like, this feels really good. Let me make a space here. And this is how we start to do those things. And we just let ourselves lead, right? And okay. And so I also keep cooling towels for walks. I put them around my neck, my shoulders, my head. I have ice in my water bottle during the day. So that's kind of cooling me from the inside out because of that, extra heated upness I get. I have those earplugs in my purse. I have snacks available because not eating triggers meltdowns. And if there's a place with strong smells, I leave instead of subjecting myself to that smell. So here's what this looks like for emotional sensitivity now. So I give myself grace in friendships, and we can maybe do an entire episode on friendships at some point, because I know that's a big category and important. Let me know on Instagram if you want me to do that. So yeah, I give myself grace in friendships. I'm cultivating this understanding that I'll sometimes take a while to respond to messages. I tell friends that I need processing time when I feel that emotional overwhelm is like hitting me. I've started exploring written communication for important conversations, or sending asynchronous voice messages that give me time to sit with others' responses before replying back. Like all of these things start to be built in so I can let myself ride my emotional waves, right? So that I can let myself come to the other side. So I'm not putting pressure on myself to make decisions or to have replies or whatever it might be in the spot when I know that emotional sensitivity is a reality and is what's going to hit. So here's what I want you to know. None of this works if you are still fighting your needs or apologizing for them. And not to say that it's like an immediate snap the fingers and suddenly I'm not apologizing for my needs. This is stuff that we have to unpack and kind of shift over time. But really the real shift isn't just knowing what you need, it's giving yourself permission to need it. So your sensitivity isn't a character flaw to overcome. It is information about how to create a life that actually works for your nervous system, which is great to have information. So what I want you to take away from this is, yes, you're not too sensitive. Your nervous system is giving you accurate information about what you need to function well. And the goal isn't to become less sensitive. It's to design a life that honors what your sensitivity is telling you. We are not wrong for needing what we need. We're incredibly attuned, actually, like both to our nervous systems and to others' emotions. And so the problem isn't our sensitivity. The problem is a world that dismisses sensitivity as weakness instead of recognizing it as valuable data. When I stopped trying to kind of toughen up and started listening to what my body needed, then everything got easier. Different is not less than. Okay, let's close out this episode. So next time we are talking about those simple things that somehow feel impossible for our brains and why executive function is way more complicated than anyone tells you. All right, so if this episode resonated for you and you know another AuDHDer who needs permission to honor what their nervous system is telling them, send this their way. And then come say hi on Instagram at AuDHDsparks. And you can learn more about my work over at adriasophia.com/AuDHD. All right, this was so good to be with you today, and I will talk to you in the next episode.